The U.S. government has issued a number of initiatives to make government data more widely accessible and useful, including the Federal Data Strategy, the Evidence Act, the Open Government Data Act, and others. For chief federal information, data, and technology officials, that has meant making concerted efforts to implement policies to transform data into more valuable assets for their constituents and their stakeholders. I'm Wyatt Cash with Scoop News Group, and here to talk about some of those efforts are Justin Marsico, Chief Data Officer at the Bureau of the Fiscal Service, and Michael Hoke, Vice President for Software Engineering at ICF. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. And let me start with you, Justin, by asking, give us a brief sense of the role of the Bureau of the Fiscal Service and what role it plays at the Department of Treasury, and whom it exchanges data with, and perhaps the biggest challenges that you're trying to tackle now as Chief Data Officer there.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me here, Wyatt. I appreciate it. So the Bureau of the Fiscal Service is a part of the U.S. Treasury Department, and our role is to help to run the financial operations of the federal government. So we do things like help to disperse payments for federal agencies that need to be entered into the financial system. We help to collect revenue that's due to the federal government, whether through taxes or fees. We also do government-wide accounting so that we have a sense of where all of the money that's been appropriated by Congress or authorized to be spent, that we have a good sense of where that is. We auction Treasury securities, savings bonds, something that has been on people's minds over the last year, but we also do auctions for institutional investors. So that's what the role of the Fiscal Service is. And as you can see, there is a lot of information and data that needs to be exchanged with federal agencies in order to make all of this right. So there are hundreds of federal agencies in the federal system. Most of that number are relatively small, but all of those need to have some type of communication and data exchange with the Treasury Department, and that is the bread and butter of what we do at the Fiscal Service. One of the biggest challenges that we have, I would say here at Fiscal, is actually accessing and using our own data internally. I think we have a very mature program that takes data that the public needs to know and makes it available for them to see. We run a website called usaspending.gov. We run another website called fiscaldata.treasury.gov, where you can go to get information about federal contracts, federal grants, no matter what agency has issued them, information about the debt, deficit, interest rates on those websites. One of the challenges that we face is that when we're trying to answer basic questions about our own finances, our own HR, it often takes a lot of manual effort to get to those answers. So that's one of the things that I've been focused on, is partnering with our HR area and our own CFO office to try to figure out how to get data faster where it needs to go, so that we can do analytics with a faster time to market.
So Justin, many agencies are grappling with how to maximize data use and data sharing. One approach, as you know, involves allowing analytics and processing to be done where the data already resides instead of moving data to outside tools and platforms. I'm curious, how feasible do you see that being as a concept in the federal government, and how do you see it unfolding at your agency?
Well, in general, I think that it makes sense to take an all of the above approach to solving data problems, and to see what works for agencies, how they can build something that is secure, that's fast, that's performant, and that actually answers the questions that they have in the use cases. So I think that there's a lot of possibility in that type of approach. I think one of the downsides that one would face in trying to implement that depends on the type of legacy systems that are already in place. So if you have a relatively mature system, a modern system, a system that's been, that sits in the cloud and uses, leverages modern tools, it can be very easy to take that kind of approach where you're leaving the data where it is, you're virtualizing it, you're doing analysis somewhere else. If your data is sitting on a mainframe system, it could be more challenging to go about that approach. So I think it's just all about trying to figure out what is the fastest, most cost-effective way to go about doing this. And one other thing I wanted to make sure I emphasize that you mentioned in your question is it's important also not to overlook the data sharing part of it. It's not just about technology. One of the things I found is that it really helps to have clear roles and responsibilities for when data sharing needs to take place. And what I've seen is that when those roles are unclear, people tend to default to what they see as a safe position, which is saying, no, this data can't be shared. The challenge is in organizations, when you say that over and over again, what happens is that informal channels can pop up. People end up pulling reports and sending them over email or putting them on shared drives. This is something that people talk about a lot within the data community and the InfoSec community. So I think it's very helpful to have clearly delineated roles for who makes a decision about when data should be shared, how that decision is made, and when the data sharing needs to end, like when the person is done using the data, what happens to it? So it's not just sitting somewhere unobserved and unaccounted for.
Well, Michael, Justin makes some interesting points there. I'm curious, how realistic is it to have analytic tools go to where the data resides instead of the other way around? And what has changed to make that concept something that agencies can realistically achieve?
Yeah, so certainly there has been some advances in technology that enables that. So let me give you one example. Within the genomics domain, this is kind of the perfect use case. They have really large data volumes, sets of data that are just gigantic. They sometimes contain private health information or PHI in them, so the data sharing can be quite complicated. And the data use agreements to share them is also very complicated. So trying to move that data not only is costly, but it can be very risky and very complicated. So, and then in addition to that, they want to run these really complicated analytics against that data. And so they aren't just a single calculation with a single tool. So they have to do a very complex data analysis pipeline. So the folks at like Global Alliance for Genomic Health have started to find some standards of how to do this. And the first step is to take the tools, the analytical tools that you're going to use, and containerize them, basically package them using something like Docker, where you put whatever's required for that tool to run in the container, and then that tool can run anywhere there's compute, sufficient compute to be able to run it. It doesn't require a specific operating system. It doesn't require specific libraries to be installed or other tools to be installed on that environment. Then once you have all of those tools containerized, right, then you need some sort of a workflow engine to stitch that all together into a pipeline. So take the data, instantiate one of the tools, let it run its analysis, and then its output becomes the input for the next tool. And you stitch it all together into a full pipeline that is now a reusable, reproducible pipeline that can be run anywhere as long as there's compute available to do so.
So Justin, back to you. When it comes to analyzing data, what measures are you and your agency colleagues taking to make data analytic tools easier to use and more widely available so that decision makers at all levels have more of a chance to use data for mission success?
One of the first things that we did when we were standing up our data program and our Office of the Chief Data Officer a couple of years ago is we started what we call an analytics community of practice. And the goal of this community of practice was to bring together analysts, data scientists, interagency, people who are analysis curious, coming together to learn from what each other is doing, both in terms of like how they're coming up with use cases and executing them, but also the tools and techniques that they're using along the way. So to do like a little bit of demoing, a little bit of show and tell, a little bit of like meeting and greeting other people, so that relationships would exist and people would know where to go if they had a question about using a certain library in R or Python, something like that. One of the things that we discovered as a result of bringing people together was that we had access to, we had approved analytics tools that in theory were available to everyone who worked for the fiscal service, but people just didn't know about it. So that was a real big realization, and something that was very easy for us to accomplish is getting people onto a list so that they could actually use the tools that we'd already acquired as an agency. It was just a matter of like connecting the dots. So we're really happy about that. The other major thing that we've done in this area is we have been piloting, or we started piloting a year or so ago, a data education and upskilling curriculum. And at the beginning of this fiscal year in October, we launched something that we cheekily called Fiscal Data University, which is it's like a small cohort of people who work for fiscal service, who are going through a year-long program where they're getting access to online training, but then also meeting with people in my office on a regular basis to ask questions and to make sure that they're generating projects, use cases, which they're actually executing on to help the place where they work. So I guess to summarize, we're trying to make sure that people can actually access the tools that we have, that they know where their friends are in the organization to help them. They're also getting formal training on how to use those tools and become more proficient.
And Michael, I'd be interested to hear your perspective. What developments are you seeing that are making data analytics easier and more accessible, and maybe as importantly, more insightful for large organizations and agencies in particular?
Yeah, so building on kind of what I talked about earlier of the standardization of kind of moving the analytics to the data. Some of the standards, like if you containerize the tools in Docker, you can actually share those tools through Docker registry and make those available to other people in the field that want to do those same kind of types of analytics. Of course, there may be licensing constraints on that. You may not be able to do it with everything, but you can do it with a lot of the tools. And then with some of the new workflow definition languages like CWL, the Common Workflow Language, or WDL, Workflow Description Language, you can define that whole pipeline in a standardized way that's just a shareable XML or JSON file that you can share with other people in the community as well. And by sharing that kind of analytics, tools and knowledge and process, you're giving the building blocks to the other people in the community to do that kind of same analytics and to build on top of what you've done by allowing them to kind of stand on your shoulders, right? They may be able to discover novel new insights that you never even considered. Another approach we've seen is people using common standardized APIs to access data. One example I'll give you in the healthcare domain is HL7's FHIR standard, the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. So they're defining an international standard for how to access healthcare data from any kind of a system. And when you have a common API like that, now you can write analytical tools that can query the data using that API that, again, can run wherever that API exists. And if that API exists on lots of different systems, you enable that analytics across all of those systems. It also enables the interoperable exchange of data. So in some cases, you may have like hospitals who don't have a lot of compute available to do the analytics in the hospital, but they have a collection of hospitals that can report up to a major organization that can collect that data. So that standard also enables that interoperable exchange of the data from those different places into one location where the analytics could be run. And you can build in all of the authorization, authentication, and security that you need to do for that transport and limit how much data is being moved to just the essential data set required for the analytics.
Justin, I'm just curious, how are you seeing data standards impacting the exchange of data with other federal agencies?
Well, first of all, I want to just start by saying that data standards are still really important. I think, there's a lot of exciting possibility out there with bringing together loosely standardized data or non-standardized data with AI and seeing some magic take place. But for the time being, the way that we see data standards and the way I would encourage others in the data community to see data standards is as an investment in making your business process easier in the future, making your life easier in the future. And whether that's by standardizing data so that you are driving down or keeping low exception rates in transactional systems, or to the analytics work that we do, making the process of doing analytics easier, bringing together, joining data together that comes from different systems a lot easier. So I just wanted to say, data standards are still really, really important. One of the advantages that we have in the financial part of the public sector is that we do have a lot of well-defined standards for data. And that's because that we have to comply with different types of accounting rules. We have to comply with different types of reporting requirements. And those requirements force us as financial managers to have standardized data in a lot of cases at the lowest level that data is kept, so that when it is reported or audited on, it's already in a format that is relatively standardized and can be exchanged, whether with Treasury or with other agencies if necessary. One recent example of this, which I just wanted to highlight quickly, is there was a infrastructure law that was passed relatively recently, the bipartisan infrastructure law. And this spending on this law, which will take place by multiple different agencies across the federal community, EPA, DOT, Energy, among others, by simply adding a tag to existing data that's reported to USA spending on contract awards, on grant awards, we are able to now go in and see in a single place all of the government spending on the bipartisan infrastructure law. Now, they're just at the beginning part of this process of like identifying awards and starting to spend on those, but we will be able to track through the life cycle of where those funds go that were appropriated to help our infrastructure. And that's because all those agencies, EPA, DOT, Energy, and all the others, have already done the hard work of standardization. It makes it very easy to come in at the end and add a tag that says this is where the money came from, and to make all that analysis for people in the public who are wondering what are happening with these funds, where they're going, what projects they're supporting, easier to find.
And lastly, gentlemen, I'd like to hear both of you give your recommendations on what it would take to really improve the exchange of data, especially knowing that agencies still tend to cover their information. Justin, let's start with you, and then we'll get to Michael.
One of the first things that I think is helpful for someone in a data position, whether they're doing analysis or they're doing data management, architecture, leadership, to think about is getting outside of your own community and getting outside of your own bubble. I think very often, especially in the data science space, we can have a way of thinking that goes something like this: get me access to the data, and I will show you all the really cool insights that are going to help you and to help your part of the business. And that's a great subset of use cases. And I am not trying to denigrate that at all. But another really exciting place where you can add value is by watching what other people are doing in your organization, where they are struggling with data, where they are doing manual processes with data, where they're applying macros on top of macros. And with a little bit of help from you, you can make their business process a lot easier. So I try to say, like, get out of your own bubble and go meet people, find out what they're doing, and see how you can be a strategic advisor or consultant to help generate faster business value.
Great point. And Michael?
Yeah, and in building on what Justin just said, actually, one of the things that we've seen a lot of value in is hosting what we call hackathons, where you invite the people who are going to try to use your data, and you put your data experts online with them, and they bring their tools, they bring their use cases, and you just try to figure out, how do we get access to the data to do what it is you're wanting to do? And if you can figure it out, great. If you can't, then that becomes requirements, right, for the next generation of the APIs or the methodology for however you're accessing the data. And so those have been very useful, I think. I'm very encouraged to see the different federal agencies willing to share the data, and I think that's great. I'm glad to see that that's happening more and more. But I think one of the things I'd also say is, in addition to sharing the data, it would be good if we can also start to share the analytics, the tools, the pipelines, and the processes that are being built to do the analytics on that data. And by providing those building blocks to the community, we just make everything better.
Also a great point. Well, Justin Marsico and Michael Holk, thank you very much for joining us today, sharing your insights about sharing data across government and some of the new opportunities through standards and other tools to make that easier for federal employees. So thank you both for joining us.